The Harlem Renaissance was a time of rebirth in the city of Harlem, New York. It was comprised of mostly African Americans. During this time, it was an explosion of culture in which art, music, and literature. It was a time when African Americans expressed their culture and talked about the injustices that they faced during this time. Popular artists of this time were Louis Armstrong, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Duke Ellington. The most popular genre of this time was jazz.
The Great African Migration was a movement that began in the 1910s following World War I. During this time, over 6 million African Americans moved from the rural southern states to the major cities in the north. It was because of this movement, jazz was carried from New Orleans and placed in the north. Jazz is a very upbeat form of music that originated from American blues and African chants.
During the 1920s, African Americans were subject to discrimination, making it hard for them to find jobs. Race riots and lynch mobs were also very common during this time.
Festus Claude McKay was born in Clarendon, Jamaica on September 15, 1889. At the age of 7, he moved to live with his older brother, who was a school teacher. It was during this time where he learned British literature, science, philosophy, and at the age of 10, he began writing.
During his time with his brother, he met with Walter Jekyll, who heavily influenced his work. Many of McKay's works about his homeland were inspired by Jekyll. At the age of 17, he moved to the U.S., where he mostly lived for the rest of his life. Here in the United States, he quickly learned that racism was a social norm and segregation was a common theme in his works.
Like many writers in the Harlem Renaissance, McKay was heavily influenced by racism. The subject of racism was the subject of one of his most famous poems, If We Must Die.
If We Must Die is the poem that makes me a poet among colored Americans. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back.
The poem is a good representation of racism, as said before, and it also takes us back to how racism was a huge factor on how artists, writers, and musicians lived their lives. McKay was wanting equality, and it shows through this poem. For example, white Americans of that time were sometimes ruthless in the way they treated blacks.
Here is an exclusive interview that we recently discovered from Claude McKay. Today, on April 30th, 1949, Channel 15 News caught up with famed writer Claude McKay in Harlem, New York. We have Ryan Alexander with him now. Ryan? Hello, Mr. McKay. My name is Ryan Alexander from Channel 15 News, and I have a few questions for you today.
Hello, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here today.
We are grateful to have you. To start off the interview, I would just like to ask, what has been the main inspiration for your works?
To be honest, there are numerous things that inspire me. For example, I was influenced to write many of my poems because of the racism that I faced during my life. Also, the people in my life were also what drove me to success.
Can you tell me who some of these people are?
Without a doubt, Walter Jekyll.
Who was Walter? A close friend? A family member?
Well, Walter was a friend of mine I met during the time when I spent with my brother in my homeland. He influenced most of my poems on my homeland, Clarendon.
That's good to know. Now I know who to thank for the many poems on Clarendon. Are there any other interesting facts we should know about you?
I got a divorce with my wife, and I'm bisexual. I experimented with cocaine and opium.
Oh, that's very interesting. About your divorce, Who was your wife and what was she like?
My wife was Eulalie Lewis. She was my childhood sweetheart, and she was the love of my life.
What religion do you practice?
Well, I was agnostic, but when I moved to Harlem, I converted to Catholicism.
Where and what did you study in college?
I studied at the Tuskegee Institute and Kansas State College in Manhattan, and I also studied literature there.
Going back to your works, what are your most popular writings?
Definitely If We Must Die, Home to Harlem, and Harlem Shadows.
That's all the time we have today, Mr. McKay. Thank you for giving us the time to meet, and I wish you the best of luck to you in your endeavors.
Thank you, Ryan.
Gentlemen, back to the studio.
Festus Claudius McKay died on May 22, 1948 in Chicago, Illinois because of heart failure. McKay was an inspiration for many poems after his era, and he continues to inspire people today. He will always be remembered as one of the most amazing writers in the Harlem Renaissance.